In the northern hemisphere, your moon is female, your moon is women's business, and the sun is male. It's different down here. In the southern hemisphere, the sun is women's business, and and the moon is men's business. So it's completely different. So if I start with story from here, and some story about story, and then we link up there, because I think that's where there's trauma, and there's trauma between men and women, and I think there's a role for people who are neither or both of those things as well in mediating that, and I believe that's always been the sacred role of those people.
So I want to invite you all to just start by maybe closing your eyes just for a moment, coming all the way in, and just starting with your feet, just having a moment to really feel your feet on the earth. And some of you aren't directly touching earth, right? You're touching a rug, or you're touching the wood of a floor, or maybe it's linoleum or something. And I'm going to ask you for this moment just to connect into what it is. What is that material that's holding you up right now? What are you sitting on? And can you relate to it in its form of when it was alive? Whether that be tree or oil or something else. Welcome to the world of LA, where the helicopters compete with the birds. And so how wide can your listening be? As you connect to both that, what is holding you up, can you connect to the listening of the space that you're in? And I'm going to invite you into a wide kind of listening. A kind of listening that might be a little bit wider than your own perspective, than your own knowing. And can you make space? Can you broaden the space a little bit to hear something from a perspective that might not be familiar? And can you create a little bit of space in each of our own people through the kaleidoscope? Can you make space to receive something that you might not even be able to understand in that moment, but might be able to rest a little bit, reveal over time? It is my great pleasure to introduce Tyson to you today. Tyson is the author of this book, Sand Talk. I have abused this book in the most loving of ways, Tyson. Many pages are folded over. I had to take it 3 pages at a time. It's so dense. He just whips off these sentences as if it's nothing. I could just picture him typing away, and it's there are these deep thoughts that are these roots connected to another thought, to another thought, to another thought. And I literally had to just 3 pages at a time and let that digest, and then come back for another 3 pages. If you haven't read this book yet, it is a joy and a pleasure and just a delight to read. And Tyson, you've all probably read his bio because he's here, but because you're here, I'm just going to speak to that. You're a truth speaker, Tyson. I've gotten to listen to a lot of your readings and your podcasts and different things. And the one thing, aside from being a scholar, aside from being a carver, aside from being, someone who really talks story and someone who's really committed to your people of your land, I also just hear you being just rock solid and speaking truth. And I'm just really appreciative to be with you today. Tyson, you're coming in we're at ground zero. You're our first guest speaker, and in this world of sacred storytelling. And we're not teaching about the 6 bullet points for how to tell a story, and we're not teaching you how to work a story to sell your business or to communicate your point. We even question the hero's journey and its patriarchal roots and its long-term impact and influence and consequence, and specifically the Western society. So it's we're in a different realm over here, and it's one of the reasons why I really wanted to speak with you and to start with you as someone who's really rooted in one of the most ancient cultures of story. So I figured maybe we just start with ground zero and like what is it? What is this thing's story, and how does one make an approach? And specifically, you said you were speaking to like the language of spirit. Where do we where do we begin?
Well, story. Story is a psychotechnology that uses metaphors in a particular way to bring you into the ontology, the way of being, basically, of a different system, like of either another person or set of relationships or a place or something like that. So it allows you to inhabit someone else's ontology, like completely, not just not sort of steel man, not that you're not inhabiting their position, but you're inhabiting their ontology. And so it which is the best way to learn something. If you're observing someone and you're really sort of melded with them, where that self-other boundaries sort of melted away, and you are just you too, and you're connected in that way. Story does that. Story facilitates that. Story is a memory tool, like you got story, then you got superpower for memory. Anything you can work meaningfully into a story, you will remember it. Most stories you heard, you will remember. You just hear them once and you'll hear them. You remember them for your entire life. So stories are sticky like that. It's and it's hard to pin down. So I don't know. I guess I'll just yarn for a bit first before we get into that, because that's fairly technical. But look, stories are located. That's the thing. I think if it's not located, then it's not a story, it's a tale, Like there should be a narrative map in a landscape that you could follow for the story. And if there isn't, then it isn't really story. If there's no map that it's created, in your mind. So the goose that laid the golden egg should be story. And I think once it was story, like there would have been a mountain and, a river and a boulder or a set of boulders, you know what I mean? That you could follow. You could see the story in that for the goose that laid the golden egg. And I think if it was still a story, then there would be law, like not just LORE, but LAW in that people couldn't break, and so therefore you wouldn't see a lot of the economic, inequality and horrendous unsustainability we have in the world today, because that it's a cautionary tale, the goose that laid the golden egg. It's about protecting the commons, protecting your the regenerative capacity of your land and resources, and the entities that produce things, even workers, everything, but that's just a cautionary tale now. It's not really a story because there's no place. So it has to have a place. And speaking of place, like I have to position myself now in a place called Naarm, Naarm. That's what some people call Melbourne. I'm 3,500 kilometers south of Western Cape York, where my family lives. And I've been on lockdown here. We've got the world's longest lockdowns. Lockdown here for a couple of years. So I've only been home once in that time, and that was for an emergency. So it's a very different place and a very different system here. yeah, very different stories. Um, so this is a big kind of an eagle story place. The creator here is Bunjil. He takes that form of an eagle in the daytime. You see him there like that. Yeah, but sort of my story is Broga story. So we call it like Puluwai, which is father side totem, and Broga stories sort of brings you into a system, an ontology. Like a Broga ontology is like, it's got relations with water lilies and ironwood trees and mud shells, substances like urine. All of these things come into that complex. So Broga's story brings you into that. But I'm thinking about you all there. So I'm situating myself on that sort of north-south line, but I'm thinking more we should fractal, maybe bring that out further, because a lot of you in the northern hemisphere there. Are all of you in the northern hemisphere? Yeah, so you're spinning the other way from me. You got that Coriolis effect, so the world's doing that. So if you go out and turn on the tap on your sink, the water's going to be spinning down the drain in the opposite direction to my sink. And that's good, because when you guys blow yourself up, that'll buy us a bit of time down here before all of that reaches us, apparently. We'll have at least enough time to dig a nice big bunker. Anyway.
Tyson, by the way, Tyson said that anyone could ask questions at any time, so you'll have to use your digital hands to raise your hand, or you can pop it in the chat box. I have to ask if you can go back to the beginning, because I wanted to know exactly what you meant by the story. You have to have a map for your story, on the land. And you're actually speaking from a perspective that's so foreign from what I know. And can you go back and explain that a little bit more, and maybe even kind of orient us to the relationship to songlines and maybe even, I'm going to go back even one more step. Sorry to give you so many tasks, make so many asks, but it's like, you just said it, right? We're on the other side of the world. Most of us have immigrated to the land that we live on. Most of us are not originally from it. So maybe even speaking to how, if you have any guidance or how to make an approach, and how to make an approach to listen to a perspective that is so unknown or unfamiliar. Yeah.
Well, the only way to do that, to come into the ontology, which I'll explain what ontology is, of another person, is through story. So I don't know. I started like that quite deliberately, so it's misfiring, and you're like, what? Because that's how you can't learn from somebody. You can't come to any knowledge if it's just exposition like that, and you can't even come to a story unless it has place. Story must have place, and you can look into the neuroscience behind that if you like, because basically human memory is built on narrative and spatial relations, and these two are bound together. So, the parts of your brain that you use for navigation and for spatial awareness and things like this, these are associated with long-term memory, as is narrative. In fact, narrative, there's some part of your brain that they haven't figured out where it is yet, but they know it must be there because this happens. Some part of your brain is organizing all the time everything that happens to you into a story of your life. So you have a life narrative. You're in a movie all the time. That's what your consciousness does. And if you think about it, that storyteller knows what good story is. The storyteller, that is you. That one that's going the whole time, like a court stenographer or something. It's writing down everything. And it's making a story. Because anytime you think back over the story of your life, there will be maps, It is profoundly place-based. You don't have any part of your life narrative that is not located, and where you're not located at any time, and you'll find that, like, you're not the hero of the story necessarily. There is no hero of the story either. So pretty much, everything you need to know about story will be in your innate, biological, hardwired sort of business there. So anyway, you're like ontology. Ontology is basically, what is real? Oh, God damn it. What is real in the world from your point of view? That's basically it. It's your way of being. So ontology is about being, whereas epistemology is about knowing. Methodology is about doing. Axiology is about valuing. But your ontology, that's what you know to be real in the world. Now every entity has an ontology. It's the things that they know and that they're in relationship with, where they know those things are real because I'm in tangible relation to them. That's what your ontology is. So even a rock has an ontology. It has a series of relationships, with the tree that levered it up out of the ground, with its roots. It understands that. It understands the dark soil that it came from. It understands. Part of its ontology is that groundwater there, and now that it's on top of the ground, part of its ontology is the sky and all the things in it. It's the that tree relation, but then all the things that are in relation through that. And of course, its purpose over deep time there of releasing all the phosphorus that's needed for that system. So it sits within that system, and that's all part of its ontology. There are 1,000 things, like there's information in that rock. There's knowledge. So that's the ontology. So in order to inhabit the life world of a rock, to inhabit the ontology of a rock, usually you need story, because you can't think like a rock. You need metaphor. There needs to be metaphor for that. Now metaphor is the language of spirit. It's about taking phenomena and tangible, real things in this tangible physical world and translating it into metaphors. Translating it into non-tangible things that you can, hold in an abstract space, and you can move these things around and do combinatorials. You can make these little psychotechnologies of, ritual, story, things like this, and then you bring those back into the world, into the real world, because you have to close that feedback loop. So you translate real life things into metaphors, and then you do something fabulous with those metaphors over there, and then that thing you close the loop and bring that back into the reality, and it has an impact on the real world. So that's what a story is. And there's some alchemical thing that happens in that dreaming space there of spirit, when you're arranging things, these metaphors to become ritual or to become story or something like that. There is some kind of increase mechanism in that makes what you bring back more than the sum of its parts. So a story is more than just a collection of metaphors. It adds up. All of those different metaphors, the effect of a story adds up to far more than what they could provide. And I guess that's the magic of story. And there is some kind of magic that allows people to be connected in this kind of mind meld. People are connected through story in ways that they can't connect through anything else, except ritual. So ritual is also a psychotechnology, and it has, profound effects on your biology, on your chemistry immediately. So if everybody in your group was, all clapping and stomping in time, you're all standing looking at each other, facing each other in that circle, you're clapping and stomping at the same time. There's that little thing that happens with each person that you look at. You're, if they mirror back to you some action that you're doing, there's part of your brain that goes, I'll do well with this person. This person's good. This person is like me. This person aligns with me. I'm in relation with this person. And you get a nice little chemical rush, and then, and so then you mirror back something to them, and then they get that same feeling, and then they mirror back something from you, and you end up building that chemical relation in that way. It makes you feel good. Now imagine that multiplied. There's that force multiplier there that's happening. So you've got 50 people all standing around, all doing the same action in time, in a rhythm. It's like that action to the power of 10, So you got, all of a sudden, you have this psychotechnology that gets everybody feeling amazing and all connected and all in sync at once. Now, if you imagine coming into that they start dancing and singing a story, and that story is also a map of a landscape that they're all familiar with and that they're all intimately connected to. Now, if you can imagine the force multipliers in that, in terms of just the vast supercomputing powers that are available to those people now through ritual, through story. This is a human thing. It's something that all humans have done forever, for at least 1 million years. We've been doing this. And I do assert that it's that long, because that's they're the oldest sort of symbolic representations we have. So we know we've been engaged in the business of metaphor as human beings, in terms of what we have physical evidence for at least 1 million years. And yes, it is a reciprocal relation with the land. We're not just fed story through the land, but our enactment of these rituals, it does that closing of the loop thing. I said there's an increase that happens over there, particularly when you bring it back around and close that loop. That's the force multiplier, and that's why we have these increased ceremonies, and that so it causes relatedness to increase. So increase means it's different from growth. Growth is about growing the size of the system. Increase is about increasing the relationships and the combinatorials in that system. There's a simple example actually used in the book. It's really stupid. I'll do it anyway. It's just like, my 2 kids, I got a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. And we've got 4 apples left out there. And this is actually true. There's exactly 4 apples. It must be something. Now, they all want they both want the apples. They're going to fight over those. So anyway, I apply this, I change the apples into, to be represented by a digit 1. And so each apple gets transferred into a metaphor over an abstract space. 4 ones. And then over in that space, I combine 2 of those together to make 2, the numeral 2. That's an abstract. And then do the same with the other one. So I go, well, there's 2 apples and 2 apples. And there's 2 kids. So that's another 2, And so I can go, well, that's how we'll do it. And so then I close that loop by bringing it across. And I give her 2 apples, big girl, and I give that little fella 2 apples. And I haven't done the good work over there on that side, because I probably wanted to use ratios or something. I probably wanted to use a ratio of 2 to 1 or something like that, because she's twice his size. She gobbles up both of her apples immediately and wants the other one that he doesn't want. So, that probably wasn't the best way to do that. But so you've really got to do that work well over there. Because when you close the loop back into the real world, it has real life impacts, which resulted in this case in the big girl punching the little fellow really hard in the face. So, be careful with your maths. Yeah, but I mean that's what maths does, like calculus has, been able to has been able to we've been able to do things with physics over in that space and actually then close the loop over here in ways that make your phone work, in ways that make satellites work, even though time changes the further you get away from the Earth. We're able to factor all that in with like calculations and stuff. So we're able to make your phone work. We're able to, it's a pretty amazing process. Maths pretty much does that. The reason most of us don't get through it, most of us don't learn it, is because they teach it the wrong way, which is purely over there. If they were doing it with, through as it's supposed to be done, with as metaphors for real things. So if we were translating real things into numbers, doing things with them, and then doing safe to fail experiments in real time, bringing that back into the world, everybody would be a great mathematician and would love maths. But we don't do that. They expect us to sit over there in that abstract space all day, just practicing processes that we don't know what they're for.
Question. How do people who are close to the land and who share mutual grief with the land heal through ritual and story?
Well, look, I could actually talk about that, or we could try and do it together. That could work. I don't know if it will. It might not. Don't get your hopes up, but let's give it a shot. And I guess we could do it by situating ourselves in that northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere story. And I think because there's so many women here, and the men who are here, men as in, manly he, him men, quite a minority. I think that's going to be good. So I'm thinking let's do Moon Story. And let's do Moon Story, because that's where there's a reversal, a flip around between North and Southern Hemisphere. Because in the Northern Hemisphere, your moon is female, your moon is women's business. And the sun is male. That's like the sun god. It's Baal. It's like that kind of one. It's different down here. In the southern hemisphere, the sun is women's business, and the moon is men's business. So it's completely different. So if I start with story from here, and some story about story, and then we link up there, because I think that's where there's trauma. And there's trauma between men and women, and I think there's a role for people who are neither or both of those things as well in mediating that, and I believe that's always been the sacred role of those people. So I'd welcome that as well. So, all right, well, let's start with that Moon Sisters. So I'll start local, and then we'll fractalize that out globally. This is our map. Anyway, so that map for me, first I'll be here sitting on Boonwurrung country, and I'll be thinking of story from Auntie Gail Dawson, who speaks for me here in my time that I spend in Melbourne. And she's Kunwara is her name, which is the Black Swan. And and she's a Black Swan event as well. That one, you never know what's going to happen. She's very surprising. So I've got to move myself in my mental map, to that story. I've got to go 3,500 kilometers. I got to go up home. And there are bonefish there. Yeah. So there are bonefish. It's beautiful. They're bigger than the desk that I'm sitting at. They're as wide as my arm span. As long as my arm span, and they can be like that deep. And what's amazing is there's like a dotted line. There's a dotted line right along that bonefish there. and where to cut it. So it's right down the center. So you cut along the dotted line, and that takes off the bottom half of the fish, that belly, on the exact place where you just open it up, and it's a big platter of meat. So you'd be there on the beach near the mangroves. You make a big fire and let that die down to ashes and coals, and then you just put this big meat platter on there, and it just it cooks up. It's really sort of fatty and delicious and juicy. And it's the best. It's very prized. So one time there were these two sisters going after bonefish in that right season, and the bonefish were really fat. This was up on Western Cape York, right up the little eastern tip there of Australia, on that inside edge there, if you think of that map in that way. And you can only get them at night. And that's the hard thing. So they had a skin bark canoe. It was made from bark from a messmate tree. And so there's a big sheet of bark, and you've got to do it over the fire to shape it, and you stitch up the ends, with this sort of cane string. And then you got to put some beeswax in there to make sure it's waterproof. So you have a bark canoe, thin bark, and then you put some clay in the middle, and you light a fire in there, so you can have that fire there. You're out on the water at night, and you also make they had to come out of the swamp first, because they got to get that tea tree. You get tea tree bark. I don't know if you guys have used tea tree oil before. It's a big global business. Most of these are grown in China now, by the way. They kind of dominate the tea tree oil industry. They have plantations there of this. Anyway, the leaves, yes, they smell great, but we're not interested in them right now. We're interested in the papery bark of that tree. So you strip off. It's really easy. You can just pull it straight off, these big papery sort of things. Anyway, you roll that up real good. And then you bind it up kind of like, I don't know, those sage smudge sticks Native Americans use. You kind of bind them up like that, but then you smash the end of it, and it smashes out. And that you can light, and that'll work as a torch with a really good bright yellow flame. It'll burn for a fair while, So they make a few of those. They load them up into the skin bark canoe, and they head out. It's nighttime. It's a full moon night. It's exactly the right season. It's a really good night for catching those bonefish. These two sisters. So they're there. They got their fire in their canoe. They got all their fire sticks, and they've got their morkan, just kind of like a woman's fighting or hunting stick. It's really sharp at one end and then thick at the other end. So it's really good for smashing people and or things, and stabbing, spearing, and also throwing all kinds of things. And women traditionally fight with two of these sticks, two of them like that, and they do an angry dance and sway, and then they're like that. That's the women's martial art in that place. Anyway, so there they are. They've got their sticks. Anthropologists call them digging sticks, by the way, because of course women are the gatherers and men are the hunters. That's how we've organized that division of labor, with bad story anthropologically and in terms of the paleo sort of projections and pseudosciences that have sort of gone on. We'll get to that story when we start dealing with your trauma in the Northern Hemisphere there. That meta story or that wrong story. Anyway, so out they go in the canoe. They light the torches. They're holding them over the edge of the canoe, and up come the bonefish. They're really massive. So it doesn't take long before they've speared and clubbed a few of those. And they've got them, and they've got enough. That's more than enough. There's so much meat on one of those. It's more than enough to feed everybody. So these women are out night hunting, and they're about to take back all this meat, for their families and clan. But then one of them sees a reflection of the moon out on the water, because that full moon's just come up as they've decided to go back, and she thinks it's another bonefish. But that's the Moon Man tricking them with the reflection, because Moon Man's a bit rapey, in a few of these stories. So he's like luring those women, along, tricking them so they think it's a bonefish. Now, you know what happens with the moon reflection, eh? Like, you can never like see it there and then paddle over to it and touch that moon reflection. What happens when you move closer towards it? It's always moving further away. So you'll be standing on the beach and you'll be looking at the moon reflection by the rocks on the water there, and you'll keep your eye on it as you walk along the beach, and lo and behold, it's moving. And we'll get to that metaphor after. But basically, there is something in these illusions, so that becomes a metaphor for a bonefish that the women believe. So that moon reflection becomes a metaphor for that bonefish, and they believe that if they keep, doing that Zeno's paradox thing, moving towards it, that it will. So let's bring in that story from your hemisphere as well, Zeno's paradox. It's that thought experiment of the frog who jumps halfway across the pond, and then every time after that, to get to the other side, he only jumps halfway of the remaining distance. And so therefore he can never, ever, ever reach the other side of the pond. This is kind of Zeno's paradox but dreaming. They think they're going to get to that, but they never get to it. And in that illusion, that's how this big sort of turnaround curse spell thing has worked, that takes them up. So it takes them up to his place in the sky, and they get stuck there. So there's that you can see in the moon, and you can see this anywhere in the world, even in your hemisphere. You can see the two sisters there. You can see one there, and you can see one there, and they're still there. But you might have different story for that. That might be in some places that's the moon's got syphilis. In some places that's bruises. Every place has a different story. But then that's the same as when you're standing on the beach. If you've got 1,000 people all lined up along the beach on that full moon night, every single one of them has a true story for where the moon reflection is located at that time. And every single one of those stories is true, but they're all different. It's when they all come together and they start clapping up, and then they share those stories and they have the ritual. That's when the meta story is available to them. And that meta story is, well, actually that moon is shining on every part of the ocean at once. The moon's shining on every part of the ocean at once. But then if you were going to bring in another set of meta stories, it would be, well, the moon's not shining at all. It's just reflecting sunlight. That would be the other one. But anyway, that's getting too complicated. So let's bring these ones together a little bit. We'll start to think about turnaround, and we'll cross that Coriolis effect line. So I've situated that local story there, and I've also suggested that let you know that all over Australia there are different stories for that, and every single one of those stories is associated with a place and has like a songline, like a narrative map in the landscape that has geological features. The swamp where those women collected the torches, that swamp's still there, and that swamp has that story, and you still go there and do that, and you're telling that part of the songline when you're there doing that. Well, not me. I don't. That's women's business. I can't do that. But so anyway, so we have that really intensely local view, but understanding that local view is networked, is syndicated with all the other bioregions that are around that have different story for that. But they kind of, all those stories web together, so that they connect up. So in my clan, the two brothers, the Upledge brothers, that's my clan, Upledge clan, the Upledge brothers, who were fighting over a big sawfish, and they had to cut it in half and take one half north and one half south. Those two brothers, you'll find two brothers story everywhere, right up and down the east of Australia. And those two brothers like right from the Torres Straits right down to Tasmania. They have different names everywhere, and they do different things. But they're often doing battle with or hunting a very large creature that is often aquatic. So down this way, those two brothers would be called Jalanara Jaramara along the Murray River, and they're hunting a giant codfish. So it's the same, different names, same one. The rainbow snake everywhere, he has different forms, different sizes, different shapes, different names, different purposes. But the rainbow snake, that is that big continental common law that ties everything together. I would suggest it ties things together between both of us hemispheres now too. So I might just ride that serpent up now if we're thinking about that. If I follow it right up that great dividing range, north to south, that's that rainbow snake. And I was talking to a fellow in India the other day about those Nagi and Nagini, the female ones, that they're snake spirits there as well, and all the way through you go. If I go to, right up through the Americas, if I go to Europe, there's dragons. If I go to Asia, there's dragons. Every culture on the planet has those snakes. So I guess we would have our storied embassy around that serpent law coming in. That would be one common law sort of narrative to acknowledge. But we're not going to talk about that when we're talking about the moon, because we've got some healing to do and some business to take care of and some gendered mistakes to deal with. Mistakes. All right. Crimes. Let's call them crimes. Okay. Because this was an annoying thing that happened. And I'd like you guys to be able to jump in and tell Moon story from there. I'm happy to tread water until somebody does. But but basically this, and I don't know, it could be story or fragment of story or just an understanding of Moon as women's business. It could be just telling me about the time when, when you were breastfeeding and the full moon was there and you were swaying under that moon, and then you happened to look across the way and there was another woman sitting over there breastfeeding, and you hadn't seen each other yet, but you were both swaying in time. You know what I mean? It could be that, because that's that story. That was just something I saw happen once. It's not my story to share, but it still gives me to refer to it. Yeah. So there's that women's business you have up there. But there was a problem when they were creating the mechanisms of social control for great nations, of controlling time. And it's really annoying about the calendar, the way the months refuse to line up with the year. Can't quite make them do it. So, I mean, they pretend there's 12 months, but even that doesn't work. Every 4 years they have to reset. Or 3 years, I can't remember, the leap year thing. It doesn't work. The math doesn't work. And it really, really, really pissed men off when they were trying to make these big patriarchies, because patriarchy is against the laws of physics. It doesn't work in your hemisphere because you can't bend the moon to fit the cycles of the sun. The moon does her own fucking thing, as far as I can see, and she won't. And do you know what? In our stories, as in yours, there is like this, there is this kind of constant tension, and there are chases and hunts and, lost loves and frustrated loves, unrequited loves and stuff happening between the moon and the sun. There are thefts. This story here of men stealing women's magic from the sun, stealing that fire. So the Promethean thing was man stealing from the goddess down in the southern hemisphere. It was different up there. You were stealing from the big man gods.
One of the things that I'm hearing you speak to is this way of bringing all your different stories together, and you're talking about them together. And I'm thinking about right now, if I were to create a myth, if I could create a mythos of the time that I'm experiencing the United States right now. I would call this the time of many stories happening at once, and they're banging up against each other. Like,
It's because they're wrong story.
can you speak to that? Like
Yeah.
what? Yeah.
Well, wrong story is unilateral, and wrong story has no place. So wrong story is invented by one person or one group to serve the needs of that person or group, and it's designed to become a dominant narrative. They're using that story to dominate other stories. That story has to be the truth, which is why I'm always, when I'm reluctant when people talk about, talking truth to power or speaking your truth or being a truth teller, the truth kind of thing. There's that desire to have the real story that will conquer all, that one ring to rule them all, that one story that's going to come out on top, and that's just evil. So that's what we call wrong story. And then the other kind of story we call proper story, and proper story is collective and it's place-based. Therefore you're constantly triangulating the truth of that story in your bioregion by it's reflecting the collective story of everybody there. B, it's reflecting the story of the place. And C, it's coming into contact with other stories from other places and is able to sit alongside those and share truth. You're able to have two opposite things, like individual versus collective is not a continuum. It's just two sides of the one coin. Those are two ways that you need both of them. They sit together carefully. They're not two sides, two ideologies, two grand narratives or stories of capitalism and communism that must fight to the death until one of them wins. And did you notice the day the Berlin Wall fell? They called it the end of history. Yeah, there's been. I keep hearing this announced. It's the end of history. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, that was the end of history. It's like history can end now. We have our story now. History is about all these dominant narratives fighting each other for supremacy. We now have the supreme and dominant narrative, which is capitalism. So history is finished. Everybody follows that pattern and makes wrong story. So we've got placeless, stories of domination abounding, and everybody has a platform for that. Everybody is able to participate in that. Everybody has access to the media to do that. And so everybody's putting together their own stories, that must win, that must come out on top. Everybody's done the workshop globally of the art of the deal, so we know how to do that. We know that it's all about, jumping into a space and lighting as many fires as possible at once so that you can't be blamed for any particular one of them. It's about avoiding accountability. It's about winning at all costs. It's about polluting the commons. Bloody blah. We all know this story. It's a bad story. And we do need cautionary tale sort of story about that. And we need it to be good. So it has to have place as well. It has to be situated in place. And that's one of the gifts that we need to give to our descendants. So if you want to be a good ancestor, you make sure that you're doing the right story stuff. You're writing about what happened here with the right kind of metaphors that will situate what has happened here in place and in landforms that will still exist when your descendants are looking at them and remembering the story that you've left behind. Because there's no safe way to store data or story or anything else on a server or on paper in the long term. It can only happen through intergenerational, passing down intergenerational oral stories.
Question. Here in North America, wrong stories are in a gladiatorial competition with each other. Do you have any thoughts for those of us who are not born with deep roots in right story? How might we help to create such stories and to invite others into them?
It's about finding the place of the folklore that exists. You have all cultural revitalization and recovery of land-based cultures, like the Celtic revival in Ireland, for example, like, you know, any of these things, the Maori Renaissance that happened, you know, very successfully, to the point where they have like entire channels in New Zealand that's all in Maori language. You know, they have Maori universities now. You know, these things happen. Culture, language can be brought back from the brink of extinction. Same with your law. You know, you have folklore. There's folklore there. I mean, you know, and some of that is creolized tradition. If I'm thinking about Turtle Island, there are creolized traditions that are brought from elsewhere, Northern Hemisphere, you know, and that have found place there, like the Appalachia is probably the best place for that, where it's real. The Wiccan traditions there, I've spoken to some of the people who follow the Wiccan traditions, that kind of creolized into that place. That has place and story there in Appalachia now. I've seen that, you know, but there are other landmarks. And anyway, I can get back to the recovery side, but also be aware that the land has changed, that a lot of the things that the old stories refer to are no longer there. You know, mountains get mined and destroyed. Fucking mountains can blow up like a volcano when they're finished, you know. Rivers change their courses, you know. But there are also vast open cut mines. Who is bringing the true story for that? I mean, that isn't just some vague protest song. That scar will be in the landscape forever. That open cut mine, that'll be there forever. Who will make story for that? You know, and that's what you do in dialogue with the old story there that's been disrupted as well. And these are all worth doing. And it's slow. It takes generations for good story to come. You don't get to just spend a couple of months bloody writing it and going, this is the story. Although you can be, you know, one of those people standing on the beach looking at the moon. And that's worth hearing, and it's really important and really valid. But here I was talking to a Dutchman the other day, and he was telling me, because I was talking about our fire management processes for looking after the land here, and how we do burning off, and how careful and scientific that is. Different seasons, different kinds of soil, different places, different plants flowering, activating different seed banks. It's very careful what you do. He was talking about the same thing in Holland. And he has that in folklore from his grandfather, his Frisian grandfather, you know, and so he knows that knowledge of burning country. And so he was telling me all about those relationships. And I asked him about the salamander story, because I've seen that in European folklore, and I'm sure some of you will come across it. You must have, like in, you know, it's in lots of books and movies, that idea of the magical salamander that can survive, that can just walk through fire. You know, that idea that salamanders don't burn? Like, they even call products like asbestos products, they call them salamander, like, you know, it doesn't burn kind of thing. Like it's a folkloristic trope from the Northern Hemisphere. Like, and so I asked him, is their story, like, is that real story? And he said, yeah, and that's about us. It's a seasonal indicator. Because when we burn the land, the heather, in this way, it has to be at exactly the right time to activate the hibernating salamanders. Because, you know, we as humans have an ecological niche. We're in the landscape. And there's a symbiosis there now, whereby most of the salamanders won't wake up from their hibernations unless a human is burning that place at exactly the right day when they need to wake up. And the heat from the fire is what wakes them. And so they come up out of the ground and they crawl across the cool ashes after the fire's passed. And that's what that story of salamander and fire is referencing. So that folklore is real. That folklore carries knowledge of how to care for your landscape, and of all that, it tells you how to be a human being in your ecological niche in frickin' Holland, would you believe? So there is story. There is story that's there, and there's like a universe. Like, what the fuck does Cinderella mean, really? You know what I mean? What can be recovered in a real cultural revival there? What can be recovered? And what are the new stories that are needed? If you belong to a diaspora, it's like, welcome to the party. Most people do. Most people are diasporic. And I'm really, really, really sick of white people complaining about that. Because we freaking all are. You know, I'm an Indigenous Australian living in Australia, and I'm part of a diaspora. I'm not in my homeland. Anybody who wants to work in a job and make any money can't live on their homeland because they don't give jobs to locals. You have to move away. You know, if I'm from Western Australia, I have to work in mines for mining companies on the East Coast, and vice versa. You know, you have to travel away if you want to work. And most of us have been broken up. Families have been broken up. People were transported in cattle trucks and all kinds of things everywhere. So most people are mixed up. We're part of an involuntary diaspora in our own land. Most people on the planet, 90-something% of people are not living in their homelands. So stop whinging. Oh, but what can I do to connect? Well, we're all just having to get on with that. So you get on with it too. You know, just get on with it and stop apologizing for shit. It's really annoying. It's really annoying. Like, I'm just so sick of trying to get anything done with white people lately. So they're just completely, they can't even think. Just stuck in this endless cycle of apologizing and guilt. And it's like, okay, you're not giving your capital back, are you? You're not giving back the capital, that you stole. You're not giving it. So just shut up. Just shut up and get on with it, would you? I'm so sick of hearing it. I'm so sick of being like in a sprint. I mean, it's supposed to be a sprint. We're supposed to be innovating something. And then half the team's useless because they're sitting there moaning about how guilty they feel about being white. Fuck off. Like, just get the work done. We've got stuff to do. Everything's dying. Like, can you please just... Anyway, I'm not angry with you about that. That's just like, I'm so frustrated with the situation. And I guess you must be frustrated too. Anybody here who would call themselves white, because, on the one hand, it's like silence is not an option. But on the other hand, shut up and listen. And, you're inherently evil and bloody, bloody, blah. Anyway.
It's a whole thing.
If you found a way to redistribute all that capital, I'm sure that would go away. So it's good though. I mean, there's been some really good dialogical work done, especially around all the pipelines and things. People are learning how to respectfully come into those spaces. People are learning how to learn things without taking things away. And they're able to learn patterns of behavior and the foundations of what it takes to grow good knowledge and good story. Now that's an ancient Viking practice, that one. It's called finfaring. And finfaring is where the Vikings who lost a lot of their land, like intensely land-based animism, they would go and sit with the Same, or the Finns, and also with the Inuit. They'd sit with those indigenous people. And what they learn is processes. So they wouldn't take away the specific rituals and stories from those people, but they'd learn the patterns and processes and ways of working those connections and those relations to go back and make their sorcery, I guess Christians would call it, make the sorcery work, make the that connections work. That was a practice. That was banned when the church sort of took over. The Christian church took over Scandinavia. They have documents banning finfaring. People aren't allowed to go and talk to the indigenous people to learn story, to learn how to make good story, basically. So they weren't bringing back Same stories. They were bringing back the knowledge needed to make good story. There's a tradition of that. And that is story. Right there, that story about finfaring is that story. That's good story. You look up Rune Rasmussen for that one. He's my good mate. He's ginger Viking. he's really into finfaring, and he's recovered. So there's just references to finfaring in all these old documents. He doesn't know how it works. So who did he ask? He didn't have any old people, Vikings, to ask. So who did he ask? Well, he asked Afro-Brazilians. So he went to Brazil and he talked to the African diaspora there, diasporic communities, who had come into dialogue with the place there and the spirits of that place and the entities of that place. And they'd found a way to creolize their former, spiritual practice in a way that fit with that landscape. And they made new story there. That was good story. So that, Afro-Brazilian kind of, spiritual practices, like, indigenous spiritual practices, but the Afro, indigenous ones, that these are aligned with the landscape and the entities of the land in the new place where they are. And that's the right way to come into a place. That's the right way to come into story. And that's the right way to make sure your story has place, So, does anybody want to share anything about the moon from where you are? I didn't even get to the big trauma of that, but there was terrible violence done, around that big wrong story of the moon needing to bend itself to the sun, of the cycle of the woman needing to be denied and bent to the purposes of this false construct of 4 seasons, which is more of an economic cycle than a seasonal cycle. Everything done to women in the Northern Hemisphere, which was then visited on us as that was transported down here. It came from that desire and from that big wrong story that was mapped over everything up on there. So if you want to deal with some trauma, it's about unpacking that story and finding good story. And it is like with his story, it's good to hear different accounts and different angles of that, because that's when you see the whole thing. It's not about deciding which one is true, it's about hearing them all, because the truth is that patchwork, quilt of the whole thing. Yeah. So that, I don't know, it's weird. It's like a small group of people like stole a god from somewhere else and then deployed that god everywhere to kill the spirit and the traditions of spirit in all these other places, and then killed that god when they were done with him. Yeah. It's awful, isn't it? Awful story when you say it like that. Yeah. Anyway, that's just Nietzsche reckons. Nietzsche and Jordan Peterson, who reckons they killed God. Anyway, maybe they didn't kill it in the end. But...
Tyson, I heard you speaking in another piece about the ancient practices of an inquiry-based practice. Is this ringing a bell?
Yeah.
And it's just making me wonder about this conundrum that we're all in, with, just like you spoke to it, it's like, wow, the amount of guilt, the amount of blinders that are coming off, the amount of blinders that are still on, and all these things that are, it's like, what is apocalypse, as Michael Mee says, but it's the lifting of the veil so we can really see and face all this stuff that's been happening for such a long time. It's like, feels like we're in this really kind of extraordinary moment as humans, where it's sort of like the buck stops here. It could be like we found ourselves at a line, anymore. And so I'm curious about this, speaking about this inquiry-based practice and this ancient technology, and if that might be a thread that we can catch as we wonder about how do we tend to these broken stories that are haunting us.
Yeah.
we find our way back to or towards the, it sounds trite when I say it, but the stories that will heal us, the stories that are connected to land, are connected, that connect.
Well, I mean, so if you were to watch me doing my traditional and processes of inquiry, you'd see a lot of stages where I'm doing things like I'm making message sticks, and I'm passing those message sticks to people, and they're doing things on those message sticks, and then passing them back. I'm making law sticks. I'm making all kinds of things. I'm doing a lot of walking country and talking to people, etc., etc., etc. And you could say, "Wow, I want one of those sticks." I don't know. So can I have one of them? That's really freaking cool. I'm gonna put that on my wall. Can you show me how to make that stick? That'd be awesome. But you wouldn't be learning the process of inquiry, and you wouldn't be taking away anything that you could really use. It would just be the window dressing. What you could take away with absolutely no, accusations of cultural theft or appropriation or anything else is, like I said, the processes, the stuff that the Vikings were after in finfaring. So from my traditional methods of inquiry, you could take away like the most important thing, which is that time and place must be included as variables. That's it. And it sounds pretty simple, and you'd be like, you must be thinking that's pretty common sense. That's duh. But most research that happens out there does not include time and place as variables. So I don't know, is anybody here into like alternative medicine and all that sort of crap? You got to say that now that I've said it was crap. Like, good on you for still sticking your hand up. But look, this is really important. So, like fish oil is only medicinal in from certain places in certain seasons for very brief periods of time. And there are seasonal indicators of like when these yellow flowers are blooming, that's when the salmon oil is medicine. You know what I mean? So the idea of extracting all fish oil from anywhere at any time is unscientific. From an indigenous inquiry perspective, you have to include the variables of time and place and harvest that stuff in the right time. That's why the fish oil studies all have variable results that aren't replicable. It's not because that doesn't work. It's not because the natural medicine doesn't work. It's just that people are harvesting in the wrong time and place. Most naturopathy ignores time and place. Astrology ignores time and place. And if you're not including those two variables, then what you're doing is not really scientific from an indigenous perspective. It's more pseudoscientific. So anyway, that just a really quick answer to methods of inquiry. But yes, we want to get back to Moon Story.
Question. When I traveled to Australia, I felt like my relationships with men and women were flipped. Yet, when you said that in the southern hemisphere the sun is feminine and the moon is masculine, I had a hard time accepting that. As a woman, I'm very influenced by the moon and her feminine nature. Could you please explain more?
But see, when you were here, you would have been under the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And experienced those feminine like energies too. How cool is that? But you're still grounded and connected in the moon cycle there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But see, the other thing is here there can be quite a bit of, and I'm saying there too, there can be quite a bit of crossover and overlap and fluidity between the two. There isn't that really strict, like I said, I told you a moon story of women hunting at night. That idea of this, hunting and gathering as a division of labor, a gendered division of labor that goes back to the dawn of time, that doesn't really stand up to any decent kind of scrutiny here when I look at our old stories. Yeah.
Can I say a moon thing?
Yeah.
This is like a connection between the moon and the sun. When I was in college, I did a bunch of biology and studied plants, and we spent time on night blooming flowers. And learning how they didn't tend to have colors. Not surprisingly, they mostly tended to be white, but they had stronger scents, and that there's a whole a vast array of pollinators that are out at night. And it's like often we think of the pollinators and the activity as a daytime thing, when actually like the bats and the moths, and all the creepy crawlies and all these other things are out pollinating. And so the night I kind of met my husband, we like took this long walk all around the area where the club that I was singing at was, and we just looked at all these night blooming flowers, and really connected with them. And it was, the moon was nice and bright, but just that sense of like, actually like the moon feels like the sun of the night, the blending of male and female is, I guess, what I'm trying to say. And that it had, until I learned about it and then saw these night blooming flowers in this neighborhood, it hadn't really struck me that like there are night blooming flowers that are sending out amazing pheromonal signals and bringing corpse moths, and so that's kind of what I wanted to say.
Yeah, that's deadly.
And then I also wanted to ask you, something that's drawing me to storytelling right now is looking for stories of courage, like, and resilience in these changing times. And sometimes it's like the folks who've been deeply showing courage and resilience for hundreds and thousands of years, it's like I find myself, it's this kind of challenging cultural question, and that I think you've been talking about a little bit of, people's stories are so individualized to their groups, yet how to ask for stories of courage and overcoming fear for cataclysmic changes.
That's a tricky one.
At this point, students shared personal experiences they had had with the moon.
But look, what you've both done is shared your experience and knowledge of your place.
Yes.
And your ontologies with me, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And that, like, we refer to that as story, in our way. So in Aboriginal English, in our Creoles, so we don't put the or in front of it. It's just story. So you're sharing story when you share those things that you two just shared with me, which is pretty cool. So that's when you're sitting around like the fire and you're yarning and people are telling, different things of their experience and knowledge. That's story. Yeah. And then, I guess storytelling, for your big, your big stories, your big myths, your big, fictions even, or anything else, that they're different, aren't they? They're the ones that become, your sort of central texts. And like just, story is a different thing from, your central narrative text, of a place or a culture or something like that.
I'll jump in there. Tyson, do you have a story that you carry with you that is one of those just nourishing, a story that you call on? Do you have one of those that comes to mind that you might be able to share, either like a creation story, or just even one of those?
Yeah, they all are. They're kind of fragmentary in a way because they're place based. So I live my life under that Bulgar law, that story, and it's never something that's just told from start to finish. It's always It's like a map of place that you have. So, in my happy place is Ikalit, and Ikalit is just this beautiful beach, and that hasn't been wrecked yet. There are other beaches that I liked more, and they've been destroyed through mining activity and stuff like that. But there's still this one beach left, and that's where the body of the Brolga is, in a sort of big oyster reef, And so it's just that part. It's just that part of the story, that place. And so I don't think the whole story. It's just that place there is story for me. And then there's all those other stories that I can think of, the time when we're digging turtle eggs, and the time when tiger shark nearly got me there, when, spearing stingray, spearing crabs, digging yams, everything in that place, So when I think about Ekalit, it's story for me, but it's not the entire story. It's just that part where the body lays, but also then that idea of the Brolga eggs, and that there's only one or two eggs laid at a time. That sort of comes through in that place. Yeah. Because that's where she went, like, to lay her eggs to hide them from the narcissistic emu who kept stealing all her children. It was like that place. She had to hide out in the reef and lay eggs there. Yeah, in that story. So that emu is never far away, and the bulldozers are coming. Yeah, so we've shared story here, today across two different hemispheres, and we have that. I know we're sitting with that intent of healing some of those traumas, and these traumas that a lot of us have experienced in our lives, and maybe have experienced this week or even this morning since we've woken up. They are sitting within deeper historical traumas. And there are stories for that. There are marks in the landscape that have been made and that are waiting for story to be made around them. There are marks in the landscape that will still be there in 1,000 years. And that, if you bring that story, then people will tell it. People will pass it on. It'll outlast all of these devices. Any server. It'll last longer than the rare earth metals. That's for sure. Last longer than any book. So it's those stories that need to come, because that trauma, like right from that first sort of sin of trying to straighten everything out in the northern hemisphere to the solar cycle, to make everything subservient to that. Julius Caesar couldn't do it. Augustus Caesar couldn't do it. Nobody got it right. They worked really hard. There's even there's a few people who suggest that that's what Stonehenge was for. It was an attempt at a big magic trick to try and bring the moon into cyclic alignment with the solar year, because it was just really annoying. There's a cool fiction story by Bernard Cornwell about that. He basically just writes blood and guts sort of historical novels. He's American. He seems to know quite a bit of stuff, although every single book he writes is exactly the same story.
Tyson, question about storylines.
Sweet.
He's asking.
The in the chat there, the narrative stuff, like the like songlines, the narrative landscapes, place-based stuff. Well, these I don't know. I guess that was the term songlines. That's sort of, I don't know. That wasn't our word for those things. It was kind of a construct by anthropologists and linguists and stuff. But we use that word now, quite a bit. And so, I guess if you're from a tradition that you're still connected to in Europe or the UK of ley lines, then you might understand the energetics of that. If you're through Asia, you'll understand that idea of these lines of energy running through the land. So often these correspond with the stories, the songlines in the landscape will correspond with those lines of energy. They'll also follow, rivers. They'll follow trade routes, things like this, and they connect up. Every geological feature in the landscape, is part of a story, and they sort of connect together like that. So there is this kind of narrative map of the landscape, and that's your, I don't know. In that way, the map is the territory, because it's a 1-to-1 ratio map. It's a map that's as big as the land itself, if you know what I mean. I was talking to a cartographer about that the other day, and we were talking about that old, idea of, is the map the territory? Is the territory the map? And there's that thought experiment of a map that's as big as the land itself. And it's just sitting on top of it, kind of thing. And I said, that's what dogs do. Like dogs' maps are made of smells, made of scent. And that's a map that is like this little AR, this smell-based AR, augmented reality map they place over the landscape. So their map is, as big as everything that exists. And they pee on it, like when they want to make changes. Isn't that great? Dog maps. There's story for you, just that. I find thought experiment is story to me. So that's the way I've come into dialogue and relation with the Silicon Valley people and the complexity theory people and all that kind of thing, is that they all do these thought experiments. And the thought experiment is the story. And it's a good story practice too, because there is kind of a story, a situation, that's explained, that is kind of a story, like this happened. And then, but they'll often leave it open-ended in a lot of ways, so that everybody can then come in and interact and yarn around that story, but show their different spot where they're standing on the beach, from their point of view. So it's a way of, it's not only a story, but it's a story protocol of bringing people together. So I quite like the thought experiment thing. It's the closest thing I've found to our practice of storying, the thought experiment. Yeah. So there is that classic thought experiment of, the map that's as big as the land itself. Yeah. And it's just really cool, because that allowed me to see the world from a dog's perspective. It allowed me to inhabit dog ontology for a minute, which is really cool.
There's a group that gathers in Hawaii. It's a song circle. People come from all around, and they share songs. And there's a story about this one woman there, and she was carrying a song that she'd received from the oak tree on her lands, I don't know, on the East Coast. And someone came over to her, and they said, "Oh, you're missing a line from your song." And she's like, "What do you mean? This song came from an oak tree on my property, lives on, And this other person was like, "Well, but the oak tree on my land sang the same song, and you're missing a verse." And I just
And both of them were missing each other.
But they were on different sides of the tree, both listening to oak trees, and both saying this song. Yeah.
Question. Recently, an Australian mining company dynamited a sacred site. What does it mean when the story of a site is destroyed in this way?
It's hard to know what that means, but places get destroyed all the time. I think the most important thing is that the stories have to be diverse, syndicated, and networked, and that they're all telling part of that bigger story. And I think that's the only way to have any kind of sustainable, like narrative sustainability, if you like, is because you should be able to destroy any particular story or part of a story or part of a landscape. These things happen periodically. There are volcanoes, there are earthquakes, there are cataclysms, there are sea level rises, there are all kinds of things. So you should be able to have, if you've got a good networked, syndicated narrative system of governance, then yeah, you should be able to damage any part of that system and the system will recover. There should be enough clues and parts and pieces about that story held in other places and in other parts of other stories that you can piece it back together again, or find the new story for that new place or landform there. And it should be the same with cultures. Somebody's keeping it for you. When you're removed, when places are destroyed, when communities are moved on. I don't know. I don't know. The Sikh, I reckon the world experts on that are the Jews. Like, how mad's that? Like, we complain in Aboriginal Australia, but we've only had a couple of centuries of it. They've had a couple of millennia of being displaced and moved around the joint and genocided and moved on and limited and restricted and denied access, denied entry, killed and enslaved and killed, just forever. And through all that, no matter what in every country, doesn't matter what language they're speaking or anything else, they still have their own shit together and they still have their stories. You know what I mean? They just kept them. And they kept them because they spread out. They distributed. They all didn't try and sit in one bloody place, holding on to it and, arguing over which part of it was the truth. There's there's, a billion shades of Judaism that I've seen so far, and different everywhere it lands. It's all over the shop, but it's all one story too. And I tell you, I've never seen any cultural group that's got their shit together as much as the Jews do. I learn from them all the time. I try to cultivate my Jewish relationships really good so they can share their secrets with me. How the hell do you do sustainability? Everyone's asking me. I'm like, oh shit, don't ask me. I'm asking the Jews. But that's pretty hard when like half the population is sort of blaming the Jews for global instability. So, my point of view is that they've got the secrets to resolve that, not the secrets to catalyze it. Yeah.
There's a lot of commitment to remember. I think more than, like a lot of commitment to remember. And sometimes you don't even remember what you're remembering or why.
Yeah.
And that's kind of an interesting piece, is like, what is it to carry a story? Because it's you're born with a job to keep carrying it.
Yeah.
That's something that I inherited. It's really literally like born to keep carrying that story.
Yeah.
And that's there's something in that that's honestly braided into this whole piece that you were just speaking to. Like, don't come here with my guilt. Don't waste my life force. This is what I'm interpreting. Like, why do you make me carry your guilt? Go deal with your guilt somewhere else.
Yeah.
Your life.
I don't mind that. I don't mind working through it with you, but when it's appropriate, not while we're trying to do something else. It's just like if it's completely hobbling you, and we're trying to do a research project, and I can't work with you because you're not doing anything. You're just sitting around whinging all the time about your guilt, and you can't think straight because you're always worried that whatever is going to come out of your mouth is going to offend some bastard. It's like, well, you're just going to have to take that blow. You're just going to have to take it. Right now, I'm going to hit you myself. If you don't help me out, we're supposed to be doing this together. You're a co-author, for fuck's sake. Join in. You're the one that's going to get top billing anyway, and you haven't done any writing or any of the research. I've done it all for you. I'm supposed to be the token blackfella that you're including in your paper, and here I am doing all of it for you. Because you're just stuffing around. Do the guilt later. I'll help you out with it. But just fucking schedule that in somewhere else. Jesus Christ. Anyway, I just think a lot of people are just completely disabled at the moment, cognitively, by having to perform the guilt.
Well, there's a lot.
It's the performativity of it that's what's getting in the way. It's not the actual guilt itself. And it's and guilt is an individualized thing. It's a personal development fucking thing. Move on from that and get into some collective feeling around shame. Shaming's productive. Shame brings people together. Shame is something that is something that assists with social cohesion. But your individualized guilt package is just bullshit. You know, I'm so sick of you trying to look inside and find your inner racist and fucking purge it. I mean, isn't that really obviously really Catholic? like to do that. Can you stop doing your personal development? There's nothing inside of you. There's nothing in any of us. Nothing worth looking at anyway. You know, stop actualizing yourself. Fuck yourself. Look out to the other people around you. You know, yourself is in your relations. That's your unique patterning, your web of relations in the world. That's where your mind really is. That's who you really are. So look to your relationships, make them good. Have good story. Have good story with the people that you're connected with. And do good story together and be in that. And they could be shame stories of shame, you know, and you can feel that together. You don't have to do it on your own, being individually guilty. It's bullshit. It's not helping anyone. But some collective shame around historical stuff, those big stories, all the different versions of it, that's good. It seems to work pretty well. Spread it out a bit. It's just too intense, like on one person. You're not Jesus.
Question. Can you speak about how songs are connected with place in your culture?
It's just a different modality for the same thing. I mean, everything is just different expressions of the same of the same thing. You know, so there is the physical, you know, landforms in the landscape, and those things are communicating it. Your way of walking that and being in those places, that's communicating it. Your way of storying those places, the stories you tell, that's another text for that. Those same stories can be sung, those same stories can be danced, those same stories can be imaged, you know, they can be drawn, you know, on rock or wood, they can be etched, they can be carved, you know, they can be carved as statues, they can be, you know, it's all the same thing. It's just part of your practice, and everybody has their different ways of coming to it, and you know, different ritual, different ceremony, different roles in that ritual. I'm the fellow who, you know, I'd love to be the one who stands up the front going, like that kind of thing, but I'm the fellow who stands up the back going, you know, keeping time. That's who I am. So I can't talk much for being you know, I know some songmen. I'm pretty good mates with a couple of songmen. Yeah, and then they're the ones who they have a process of inquiry where they have to go in that dream and find the new song in like that. It's very rigorous. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know much about song. I was deaf for I don't know, most of my childhood, so I missed out on much of an appreciation for music at all, actually. Well, I don't know what all the fuss is about. People always listen to these songs. I'm just like, yeah, that's good. It's all right, but people are like, you know, think we're alone now. Doesn't seem to be anyone. I just don't feel it. Just don't feel as inspired as everybody else.
Tyson, thank you.
Yeah.
For your generosity of spirit and your just deep dive into the wonderment of how to be with story, and really like bringing us to a place of land-based, map-based story. Tyson, thank you so much. You make yep, you gotta go. And you make just like coming together and being real together a real pleasure and a joy. And I'm walking away with this really simple piece of ingredient and recipe in terms of can our stories fit together? How many stories can fit in the room? And if they don't fit, if they can't bump up against each other, then that's a very clear indicator of alignment or lack of. I'm just using the word alignment to be easy since we're trying to walk out the door here. Thank you. And if there's any way that we can support your work, Would you please send me a link and I will send that in the replay to everybody and ways that people can stay involved or any kind of ways. I know a lot of people would love to know.
I don't have any pluggables.
Great. Okay.
I got no pluggables.
Okay.
Hey, all right.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Love yous.
Take good care.